trust is, it sounds obvious, but the why dictates so much of the project scope when you start to build out the requirements and set expectations for the challenges you need to overcome. Particularly in these tenant migrations. We worked in such a diverse range of contexts for tenant migration, from high-profile acquisitions to amalgamating disparate tenants that have been sort of getting by, operating in silos, to highly sensitive divestitures with lots of politics and Chinese security walls to factor in. We've even seen a tenant migration required because someone made a really poor choice in naming their tenant with the IT admin's name in the initial setup, and suddenly this name appeared in many of the URLs and links that were being used on the tenant. More the reasons for migration establishes a range of questions that you really need to consider to create the policies, controls, and settings in the new tenant. So a few examples that we've worked with and some of the experiences we've had is, for example, in a merger or acquisition, there really is, first of all, I think, quite a different sense of kind of togetherness. The organizations are going forward together. So there's an opportunity to balance both the security and governance policies which apply to both, but also look at potentially what's good for both organizations going into the future. And that's important because there is, there's definitely more cooperation between the organizations. And some of the other scenarios we've worked in is, for example, where we've had different geographical data locations or data changes, and here either, for example, a region, one of the Microsoft data centers perhaps wasn't available when the tenant was created, or, for example, it's a large global business. They've run a relatively federated IT organization, and in the scenario potentially there are a number of regions have their own tenants, and as the organization looks to the efficiencies and potentially from licensing by being able to do the licensing centrally, and then also looking to centralize control around both security and governance, there's potentially a requirement to bring some of those tenants back under a single tenant umbrella. The other example we've had, which is slightly different, is, for example, organizations which, from a geopolitical perspective, have, for example, a business in China, where there's actually a legal requirement that the business in China sits in a tenant within China, where on the other side of the Great Wall of China, as it were, the Great Electronic Wall of China. So different scenarios there from the geo side of things. In a divestiture situation, these are usually a little more tricky. In this situation, we've had experience of businesses that are right sizing or that are going back to their core, their core business and looking to sell off parts of the business. The other slightly tricky thing here is usually when they sell those subsidiaries or subsections of their business, they're often selling them to somebody in the same vertical or even a competitor in the industry. So it's there's a lot more sensitivities around the tooling and the process we use to actually carve out just the information that's pertinent to that business, because you really are now having to separate the information out of an existing business to be able to migrate that information over to either the new subsidiary if it's going on its own, or if it's actually joining another organization. And we found we've needed to broker and create a lot of trust. We've worked with a global catering and hygiene business where the remit was a divestiture, as I just discussed. One unit having been sold off, and here it was exactly the case. I think without winning the trust of the business that was divesting out of that organization, it would have been very hard to complete the process. We really had to go into a lot of detail around the scoping and the data privacy, and actually being a third party in the scenario in some ways was a help, because we could kind of prove to have both organizations' interests at heart, but certainly that was the most important part of the project, was working with that and defining those boundaries. Yeah, so another example, a global fintech organization. This one was interesting in that the organization were two very large fintech organizations emerging, but going to a new corporate identity, and they actually made the decision to create a net new tenant. And this was interesting. And again, a lot of cooperation, because it's in everyone's best interest to get all the settings and really take advantage and opportunity to improve security and governance and make sure there's a smooth migration. But probably the thing we had here was less that, there's no one tool or one size fits all solution. These were large organizations previously. Both the founding organizations had also grown by acquisition. So we had, I think it was more than 12 domains from an identity and management perspective, which all needed to be synchronized onto the new tenant, so that when, for example, users changed their passwords, that was synchronized properly through into the new platform. And literally, you can land up with a help desk getting flooded. They also had, various different workloads, such as archives and various other things that needed to be taken into account. So really a case of understanding the situation, making sure we had a number of different tool sets. Some of the organizations, for example, weren't actually physically linked by a network, and some of that synchronization needed to be done over secure internet connections. So yeah, absolutely. Sometimes you certainly need to think out of the box and look at some of the different tooling.